Good evening. I'm Dennis Fabizak. I'm the director of the East Hampton Library. I'm thrilled to have a full room of people post-COVID. We're happy to present Brooke Kroeger. Brooke is a longtime journalist, a professor emerita at NYU, the author of 6 books, a longtime member of the library board, and the newest president of the library board. And she's here to have a conversation about her important new book, Undaunted. Brooke is joined in this conversation with Lynns Sherr and Jim Rutenberg. Lynns Sherr did her first reporting at the age of about 7 when she created a one-edition family newspaper. As an adult, she worked at the Associated Press, CBS, and ABC News, where she spent more than 30 years, mostly at the news magazine 2020. She's also written a number of best-selling books. Jim Rutenberg is a writer-at-large at the New York Times and the Sunday Magazine. He was previously the media columnist, a White House reporter, and a national political correspondent. He was part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 2018 for exposing sexual harassment and abuse across industries.
Well, I want to say thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure for all of us. Jim and I had the opportunity recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, to do something at the library, just similar but not unrelated. And Lynn and I have been friends for a zillion years. So it's wonderful to be here to do this with them. I'm going to spend a few minutes just to give you a very broad brush idea of this book, and they've been invited to interject and interrupt. And what we'll have is a conversation, not 3 parts. What's great about Lynn and Jim, and even myself, is that among us, we represent about over 60 years of journalism history that this book speaks about, which is about 1/3 of the book, because the book goes back 120 years before. So that's where I'm going to start, but quickly, just to say that the book goes from 1840 to the present. It was not my idea. It was the idea of the editor, John Siegel, who's a very important editor at Knopf. I did not know him. He sent me a cold call email saying that he was keen to commission such a book and would I be interested in writing it. This was just as I announced my intention to retire from NYU, and I thought, heck, that's not a bad idea. I would like to do that. So that's how the project came about. He had some very specific ideas about how it should be structured. He wanted it to be chronological because that's very important for a general reader. This book was meant to be a trade book. The last time a book like this was attempted was 1936. It's called Ladies of the Press. This signed copy cost me $100 on Abe's books. I hope in 80 years someone will want to spend whatever the equivalent is for mine. It's interesting to note that you can see that a similar conversation about the cover took place because somebody added a bunch of names, as my book had to add a bunch of pictures, thinking that people want to read about people. So these books are both very much about people, but mine is really not about the people, even though it tells lots of stories. It's about what happened to women decade by decade over 180 years in this vital profession where they never found easy welcome. And that continues to be true today as we see in the absolutely vicious attacks against women online, women journalists for what they write. It happens to men too, of course. Journalists have always faced this. The difference is when men are attacked, it's about their intellect and their hackery. When it's at women, it's often sexually violent. Their pictures, photoshopped onto grotesque images, and often resulting in attacks on their home and their person and their families. So it does go on and on. But the book has lots of triumphs too. Anyway, the way I approached it was decade by decade through about 15 databases using 2 search terms, women and journalism, every time. And although that was not scientific, it did create consistency. It was a way of looking at every decade in a similar way to see what popped out, what was interesting. So let's say in 1890 or 1899, if a book of the most important Victorian women writers came out, and Margaret Fuller's name was there, and Lydia Maria Child's name was there, 50 years after they had left this earth, that told me something important. So those would be people I would look at. In the 1930s, how many people here know who Dorothy Thompson is? Is that a name anybody knows? Hands up, hands up. Okay, a few, but not many, right? She was the it girl of the 1930s. She was Beyonce. I mean, from a journalistic standpoint, she was everything. She earned, more money than Croesus. She was incredibly popular. How did I know this? Well, I happen to know it. But beyond that, I could see in a profile of her that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post over 2 issues. Like, who gets a profile over 2 issues in this middle-brow magazine that, most of America was reading in the 30s? Remember, we didn't have television. We barely had radio. And then also within the year in the New Yorker, 2 issues. So that would tell me that's someone I have to pay attention to. I used 12 questions. I'm not going to tell you all of them, but things like, so who surfaced on 10 most powerful lists, 20 women to watch, whose names would come up in generic lists that also included journalists. I'd be interested in that. I was interested in stories that best illustrated what in every decade women were up against in their professional lives. What were they confronting culturally? What were they confronting within the profession? I looked for careers that lasted 50 years so I could carry them through several chapters and you could see the trajectory. You'd have the difference of a woman like Martha Gellhorn, who everybody knows, right? I hope, who was privileged. She was from the elite class of St. Louis. I followed her, society coverage as a girl in the St. Louis Star and Post-Dispatch. Friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. When she needed a letter of introduction, she asked the president. I mean, she was in that kind of situation through the 30s, a very difficult time. And yet you'd find someone like Edith Evans Asbury coming as the oldest child of a family of 16 in Ku Klux Klan country in Ohio, looking for a way out of being her mother's aide de camp, and the career that she built with, a much more hard scrabble approach that took lots longer. Stories like that. I spent a lot of time on War and Peace. How good these women were at networking. Man, those early women were phenomenal networkers. And that's true from the beginning. Another pattern that comes through is the intersection of gender and race, which I wasn't aware of in quite the way that it came through when you do this as a continuum. Things like that. So I want to invite my friends into this conversation. And then we'll get to the 60s where we can get really hardcore.
I'm going to butt in before I've even been asked.
Please.
To say that Dennis used the word that I want to repeat about this book, which is important. It's a very important book because it lays out in a way that most people, unlike Brooke, would not have the energy or the talent or the detail specific way of going about it. But she's really gone through it. There'll be a lot of names in there you have never heard of, and you're going to miss a lot of names. And one of the smartest things she says at the very beginning of the book is it's not meant to be inclusive. It's meant to tell you about what was out there, and with luck, you will have more people to add to it. And I will say that growing up, I didn't have any female journalist role models.
Not even Brenda Starr?
Well, Brenda Starr, I was about, I forgot the word real life. Of course, Brenda Starr is sort of why I did it, and the reason I didn't have them isn't because they didn't exist. It's because we didn't know about them. And I grew up in Philadelphia, and there were certainly women who were reporters on the papers there, and there were a number of papers, but I didn't know about them. And I didn't know about the history until I realized I was a feminist and started reading the history and learning about this. So it's important to know that we have this history. And I'll end this part right here by saying you also make such an interesting point, which is that by going through it the way chronologically, you see the pattern. And the pattern is there's a lot of terrific women in every decade. And yet, every time we get to a new place, we have to start all over again.
All over again. Because
the ridicule is still there, and the assumption that women don't know what they're doing in a newsroom. So that's my overview of all this.
I think one thing you see in that is that from the beginning, from Margaret Fuller straight through, there are always exceptional women who prevail, always. The issue is that they have to be A+++, and network, and have the contacts, and having the man, because the men are in power, who are willing to give them opportunity. But they're giving them opportunity because it's good for business. These women are extraordinary. Those women always prevailed. Where the difference came was at A+. You could be an A+ man, you could be a B+ man and do just fine. An A+, B+ woman, like some at the New York Times with law degrees, were assigned to the women's desk. That's the way it was. So that's the difference.
Right, that's the keenness.
You talk about that.
Well, first of all, I love that insight in the book, is that you don't really, I hadn't thought about it that way at all, which is right, that these, so some of these losers who I've had to report to all my life, no, never, but the
Names,
women had
Jim,
to be,
names.
no, maybe later. But also just think about this, that this is the last time somebody tackled the subject. I mean, that really says, that speaks volumes. But
there's only white women in that book, by the way.
Right.
that too. I mean, so, but I also have to say it's such a great idea because I've always wondered about it. When I started at the New York Post in 1992, every cub reporter had to watch this movie, Deadline USA, with Humphrey Bogart. This Mike Pearl was the dean of the paper, and he would bring you to his apartment and we'd watch Deadline USA, which was set in 1958. And there was a badass woman reporter in that movie, like there with the guy. There are two women on the staff.
There's always one.
But,
yeah.
And she's a badass. And I've always, it had me, to this day, I'd wonder like how, so there were badass women reporters. Of course there should have been, but there were, and they were notable enough to be in a Hollywood film. That film wasn't a woke, as they might've said back then. No. But there she was. So I've always wondered. And of course, as you capture, it predates that by a mile.
I think, one of the issues when people write, and there have been some wonderful books on periods, on the Vietnam War, on World War II, on World War I, the women of. And when you do work like that, as I did with Nellie Bly, you're really looking at that period plus a few years before and maybe a few years after. So it's like throwing a pebble into a pond and watching the ripples, and you think, oh, I've covered the whole universe as all these ripples go. But you don't really have a sense of how it goes back. I had never done the 1840 to 1880 period before. So that was revelatory for me.
And as long as you mention that, I will say proof positive that nothing is new, right? We keep reinventing the wheel. Susan B. Anthony in the 19th century was very pleased with all the women reporters who covered her, and there were a number. And in 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair in Chicago, she made a speech in which she said that there should be newspapers owned and run by women, and that we're not talking women's page stuff. We're talking general newspapers, because she understood then that without ownership, you haven't got the power, which is precisely what this is all about.
And what we know now too is about diversity. That comes through in the book several times, where when Charlene Hunter Galt is at the New York Times and goes to Chicago to cover an event of important Black women and has written her story. And at that time you phoned it in, dictating from Chicago to New York to 12 different editors, as she says. And she had used the word Black over and over again. And the copy editor had changed it to Negro every time. And so she threw a flying fit. This is in the early 60s. And the New York Times changed its policy.
Point being that the policy was not that until that moment, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So
Insane.
That's why one of the reasons, if you need an example of why diversity matters, that is certainly one.
I will say, and I'm not going to ask you to stand up for everything that the New York Times has ever done.
Oh, here we go.
But the idea that they changed their policy because of that, do you know how long it took us to get the word Ms. in the New York Times?
Oh, right. But I didn't know that until reading it in the book.
Oh, yeah. Well, I lived through that. And in fact, when I was I'm getting ahead of ourselves just for a second. Okay. But when I was at the AP covering the beginning of the women's movement, the beginnings starting in '69, it was also new that I pitched and did a story on this new word, Ms. And it was so new that I had to say how to pronounce it in the article. And I did stuff, I did a bunch of women around the country. And I had to then go to the, pardon the expression, other side, to find out from people who didn't like it. And Amy Vanderbilt, was that her name? Amy?
Yeah.
Was she was the manners person.
Etiquette.
she was very upset about it. She said it's a terrible thing and it's very awkward, and Ms. needs manuscript and she would never use it.
I wonder how she'd feel about MX.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. There you go.
That's in there now too.
Yeah.
So the world, thank goodness, keeps changing. Lynn has this interesting back history to 1960 something, coming out of Wellesley, finding that no one would give her a job, even though she'd had the Mademoiselle guest editorship a la Sylvia Plath and had all that going for her. And it was completely meaningless. Maybe you'd tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's very simple, and I thank you for quoting me accurately on this, which is I graduated from college in 1963, and I got to New York, and I was told, as were all of my female friends, I was told point blank by every single white male newspaper editor in New York, and in those days there were a lot of them, we don't hire girls. It was that simple. We don't hire girls. And I had we had no recourse. And I mean, there was no EEOC. There was nowhere to go. There was nowhere to complain. And so most of us just sort of shrugged our shoulders and went around the corner and found something else. I went back to Condé Nast, where I had worked the summer before for Mademoiselle magazine. And that was my entree. Finally, I did that. And I realized after a year and a half, that's not where I wanted to be. And then I went to the Associated Press after that. And the AP was really the beginning of my journalism career. And I don't want to cast aspersions on Condé Nast, because it was a wonderful time to be there. And they were very good about hiring women, and they understood that you could hire women and not pay them all that much money. So
this has been a big place where women have found opportunity by working for less.
Right.
This has been true straight through. There is still a 17% pay disparity to this day in journalism and in other fields as well. So that did not set in until the 1880s.
That was fascinating.
That did not. Pay was equitable up until that point. And I think the difference comes, this is a little bit speculation, but when women started to mass into the field in the 1880s, to have opportunity against men, that was their only card, that they could work for cheaper. And women's news became important because it was a revenue center, and men did not want to write society. They did not want to write fashion. They did not want to write gossip. They did not want to write those things. So as soon as women thought they were getting entry by taking those jobs, not really understanding they were never getting out of them, which is essentially what happened.
And since you bring up the women's page idea, that when I got to the AP, which was in 65, that things were beginning to change in terms of women's pages a little tiny bit. And it was, of course, Catherine Graham at the Washington Post. And I apologize, that would be my phone.
It's Ms. Graham calling.
It was Catherine Graham at the Washington Post who converted the women's pages to what was called the style section. And that was about 1968, 9, 70, one of those years. I don't have the year exact, but it was a revelation. And it was a complete change in how to look at women's world, or the world of the people who are not necessarily out in the workplace all day long.
What Lynn was saying about the acceptance of conditions that were really unacceptable, which was universal practically. To me, the biggest clue to that was that it took over 6 years for women to understand that the civil rights legislation of the mid-60s applied to them, that it could be used as an instrument for addressing their employers. They didn't even they were so conditioned to accept the way things were, especially at the news weeklies where things were the worst. Not the New Yorker, because of course the New Yorker was founded by Jane Grant and Harold Ross as a couple. They were married. So she was a great feminist and worked for the New York Times, but also helped with the founding of the magazine. The other news weeklies were just, I mean, really awful. They would hire out of school a young man and a young woman with exactly the same CV. He would be hired as a reporter. She would be hired to clip copy.
On a clip desk.
On the clip desk.
Which
so
meant you sat there and you clipped articles out of the paper and put them in a folder so that the guy you had graduated with could write the article.
Story. So that was it, but it literally took 6 years to realize they had an instrument for change.
There is another point though, which is the women's movement, the second wave, what we call the second wave, grew out of the civil rights movement exactly the same way that the first wave, which is the suffrage movement, grew out of the abolitionist movement. So there's a pattern there.
So let's move to Jim. So Jim comes on the scene in the 90s.
Yes.
Such a baby.
Thank
Oh
you.
my God.
Thank you. More.
And Jim told me that all of his first bosses were women. So talk about that.
Yeah, I do. But I think they even knew that this was a change because I came in, my first job was at something called the Manhattan Spirit, West Side Spirit, local paper in Manhattan. And my two bosses who really taught me almost everything, the most important lessons of my career were both women. And I remember one of them.
Credit them.
Oh, well, Janet Allen, then Janet Wickenhaver, and Stacey Asa. And they're both still journalists. But they both taught me that, almost every basic.
I'm sorry.
That's actually Janet, I think she wants to. But anyway, but I remember that Janet very specifically said, your generation is so different, maybe because just I didn't know from anything either. So I was ready to lap up anything they told me. And they just felt like there was a different thing off my generation of men.
Did you have sisters?
I was raised by my sister and my mother. Yeah. So could be. I still think there was some generational change though. And I have to say that every important mentor I've had, or many of them have been women throughout. Now, my women colleagues my age have plenty of complaints and there are real issues still, but it was changing and continues to change.
Mm-hmm. And there were interesting ways that it changed too. When I was at the AP, after the Washington Post had done the style section, AP also had a women's page. The AP, as you certainly know, is a cooperative. It's owned by its member newspapers. So there would be articles done and sent out to newspapers all over the world. And they had these things called actual pages. Most of the stuff went out in teletype or wires, which is why they're called wire. AP and UP are called wires. But AP also had something called pages, which were printed pages, which was just a way to deliver the material that was not news pegged. So it could wait a couple of days and get sent a different way. And there was a women's page. And at one point, when I was there, the women's editor, a woman named Joy Cook, terrific writer, was leaving. And the guys in charge came to me and said, we want you. I was very young. I was in my 20s. Would you be the new women's editor? And the truth is, I knew I didn't have the experience. I knew I couldn't be I knew I was not ready. But somehow my burgeoning feminist feelings were coming through. And I actually said, and I repeat, I have no idea where it came from. I said, women's page editor. There's no men's page. What do we have a women's page for? And I think, they looked at me like, who is this person that's working here? But that was that. And then they started at the AP, a new department, which was officially called Living Today, which got known around the office as the Mod Squad because we were all young and running around and covering wonderful movementy things. But that was a big change to not have a thing called the women's pages, which used to be, and in the Times it was the 4 Fs, right? Fashion, family, furniture, and whatever.
Something else.
And it took the Times a little while to get there. But anyway, it was a wonderful step forward.
Well, the Times did have Charlotte Curtis, who turned that section into a power nexus by the relationship she made at the newspaper, by what she did with that section, turning it into biting social commentary, but subtly enough to pass muster. And that was interesting. Which
the same thing happened at the Washington Post with the style section, which became really the coolest part of that newspaper, may arguably still. So, and that has the same origins.
So Jim has a lot of history as a media critic, not only at the Times, but before that. So he and Lynn will be very interesting on the subject of broadcast, which we should address. So from the AP, Lynn was one of the first and earliest of the women who found one of 3 ways into the broadcast universe. It was either get a scoop, like interview Fidel Castro, which one person did, or have real expertise in art or something like that, which would get you in, or have hardcore reporting experience, which is what she was one of the few who brought. And then maybe take us forward that a little bit. One of the issues in broadcast has always been appearance. There's a hilarious story that Lynn is quoted in from, I think, the 80s maybe, where Leslie Stahl and Lynn and Kadi Chung are all aging out because they're turning 40. And Leslie Stahl says, "I'm not aging out. I'm in my prime. I'm riding my crest." And of course, that seems to still be true. So good for her.
But look at
Talk
what
about it a little.
well, you can talk about all the advancements, but you can also talk about the lingering behavior, and I guess we'll get into Me Too at some point, right?
And lift, goodness me.
But look at just right now, Don Lemon at CNN
Oh yeah.
said this terrible thing that came out of his mouth 2-3 weeks ago, that women aren't in their prime unless whatever age.
Does everyone know about that? Okay. Okay.
So that
And
reflects.
his proof was, Google it.
Yeah. So that's the thing of what that you capture in the book is forward, back. I mean, Me Too, and I could,
Which Jim was also very involved with.
well,
So,
and we should talk about the origins of that, because it's all, kind of about advancements and changing thinking. But I just wanted to finish the Don Lemon thing. I mean, that's outrageous. If you look at what Tucker Carlson of Fox News got in trouble for, some of it, I mean, not shocking in a way, but the way he was hurling around the most misogynistic term in his office as if, it was hello, as a lawyer who's suing someone on who was involved in that show had said.
And just to add a little history there, I fear that I'm going to be pegged as somebody who spells everything and defines everything. But and when I got to ABC, I went to ABC in '77 when Room got there.
Rune
Arledge. And things were changing in a very good way. And I pitched and did a story on sexual harassment, which had just
entered the vocabulary.
1978. And it was, again, so new that we had to spell it out on camera, and I had to explain what it was.
Really?
Yeah.
What precipitated that story? Was there?
Well, I was now the House feminist. So, I mean, I that's one of the reasons I was hired at Channel 2 is they thought I would do a lot more stories, and then it turned out they didn't want all that many stories, but that's a separate issue. Yeah, I had covered the very beginning of the women's movement, which was then called in 1969 the Women's Liberation Front. And it was one of the only times I'd had an advantage over anybody else in the office of a different gender, because they would not let men in. So there were a couple of us that got to cover things in a different way. Finally, we had the advantage. But so I just knew what was going on. I knew there were a number of stories. A woman by the name of Lynn Farley had done a book. You probably ran across her book in the course of your research on Me Too. But in any event, there's history. It was there.
But that's the same phenomena was at play in Me Too, because really, I don't know if people understand the full history, though you do get into this. But but there was one critical change, I think, that caused Me Too to become, obviously the movement had been around for a bit, but that really it caused it to explode was a younger reporter, I think should get a lot of credit at our papers, Emily Steele. And she was
I gave it to her, Jim, because you said so.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Emily thanks you. So she was working on the scandal at Fox News when Roger Ailes was drummed out over several sexual harassment cases, many in the end, sexual harassment cases. And Emily's working on this story with a team of us. And as a younger reporter, not that the behavior wasn't outrageous to anyone, she just could not believe this. Mm-hmm. And women, even of my generation, look, we grew up in newsrooms where the bosses hit on them. Once at the Daily News, one of my colleagues, we all were we were drinking late into the night, as you did in the tabloid days. And at her house, and one of the senior editors tried to crawl into her bed, things like that sort of women had to put up with. She kicked him out, whatever. But things that women became inured to. Emily said, "What the hell?" And she was so furious. And she kind of she took that feeling into the reporting about Bill O'Reilly's sexual harassment, which again, by the way, it was no secret that Bill O'Reilly had been jammed for sexual harassment. He had settled a major case many years earlier for $10 million. And the world went on, oh, okay, well, he settled that. That's over. and thinking was, well, why is that over? What else is going on here? And that helped lead to, she discovers how to kind of just really report on these stories, because critically what she focused on, because the sexual harassment stories historically have been he said, she said, he said, she said. And Emily very smartly decided, well, if he is paying her $10 million, then that's evidence of something. And she decided to find more of those legal agreements. And she used the legal agreements to establish it, and that gets to Harvey.
That's I guess the point that I was trying to make is that there was a history, and there had been Supreme Court cases that had been settled in the 70s. And I always thought once you had one of those, it was done, it was over. And what you guys proved, I mean, what the Me Too movement proved, and certainly with your reporting and all of that, is that it isn't over until there's a more critical mass, I guess. What do you
but again, the spark had to be a new generation saying, wait a minute,
right?
And then it'll fall back. Then here's Don Lemon. So,
right.
Well, he's out.
He's out.
That's the difference.
For now.
I think. He's out.
For now.
Yeah. The New Hampshire series that just dropped last week about the things that have happened in the recovery community, this series called The 13th Step, and the targeting that's happened to the woman reporter, Linda, I don't know how to say her name, Julian, something like that. And I was interested, the question, a friend of mine sent a text saying, do you think if a man had written that story that he would have faced what she has faced? Her family's had to leave the state as the story came because brick was thrown through her window with words under the house saying just the beginning. And my question back was, do you think the story would have been written or would have been pursued if a woman hadn't pursued it? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have a problem sometimes about the question, how would you cover it differently if you were female or and I don't know. I think the answer is there is no question, but that women have brought a certain sensibility and sensitivity to these things, which doesn't mean that Jim can't cover it and that other men can't cover it. It's that the impetus, I think, has to come. I mean, I brought these stories to Channel 2 when I was working there, and it hadn't occurred to any of these guys. And we documented the fact that until when I got to ABC, I'm sorry, the sexual harassment was ABC. We documented the fact that until there were more women, not only reporting, but as editors, as copy editors, as sitting around the rim, as assignment editors, we didn't have stories on childcare. We didn't have stories on spousal abuse. And I think the answer is no, it would have, the answer is yes, it would have been different had she been, had that story been covered by a man. I believe that.
Anyway, it's pure speculation.
Of course.
But one thing we do find historically is that women didn't invent the interview, but they were very good at the interview and introducing that as a journalistic form. So that's a course of change. During the wars, the earlier wars where women were barred from the battlefront, which doesn't mean that women did not go to the battlefront, because they did, and they always did back to the 1800s. But the mass of women who went were barred. So they had to report other things. So they're reporting civilian stress, the emotion of the country, the shortages, all the stories that now have become really part and parcel of all humanity's covering during conflict, and very important. Though people like Roy Gutman have done the same work. I mean, it's not solely the province of women, but women have been predominant in that kind of work.
I want to ask you, you have done such an incredibly good job of digging up a bunch of reporters whose names I never heard of. Do you have a favorite in the old days? Is there one of them?
I'm really big on Edith Evans Asbury because her journey was so hard and it shouldn't have been. So, the one I spoke about, who's the oldest of 16 children, and she marries very young. She's someone who, the family has no aspiration for her at all, but she's brilliant. So a teacher sees that she gets into Walnut Hills in Cincinnati, which is the Stuyvesant of Cincinnati, studying Greek and Latin. And then another teacher gets her into a women's college nearby. and she works in a fudge factory to make up the difference. And then in the sophomore year, a career counselor comes to campus and suggests that a woman can make a living as a writer on a newspaper. And that's the end of that school. So she is taking the bus to Cincinnati every Monday to ask the editor of the Cincinnati Post for a job. And he keeps saying, I'm not going to hire you because you have no experience. And finally, she gets the courage to say, well, how am I going to get experience if you won't give it to me? So at that point, he assigns her to the women's editor as an assistant. She does that for a little while, then she marries, because that's what someone does in 1919, and moves to Tennessee, to Knoxville. She goes back to school, she finishes, she does a master's in history. She becomes involved with the intelligentsia of Knoxville rather, and becomes the front page girl of the local paper. And she's a sensation, but she hates the marriage. She's outgrown this whole story. She takes herself to New York on vacation, sends a telegram back saying, I'm not returning. And it's the Depression. So not a great time to make this choice. So she ends up doing hotel PR and writing a few stories for the Brooklyn paper. It's, you know, not much of a career trajectory after she's really been a star in Knoxville. And this goes on for quite a while. Then she gets hired by the AP because an old Knoxville friend who was not the star when she was at the paper has a job there and helps her to get one. Of course, it's World War I time, so there are jobs because the men have gone off to war. This is when women get opportunity. Also, when organizations are failing, that's when we see lots of women prevalent. There was a story the other day on I don't know where I read it, but picture of all the women in broadcast television who are running networks. And I just thought, oh, this is a very scary sign. It's a terrible thing to say because you're like, oh, well, that's a moment for celebration. Oh, not so quick. So anyway, there's that. So she just, makes it. Then finally the New York Post hires her and she's back doing what she loves. And she's so thrilled. And almost 6 months into the job, she's covering a potential suicide watch off a Grand Hotel, calls in at 5 o'clock to say she's going home. The guy's still on the roof. And the editor says, please come in. And she thinks, oh, I'm going to get an out-of-town assignment. This is great. And of course, he fires her because there are cutbacks. She's last in, first out. Of course, it's a few days before her 6 months. So she does not get severance. She does not get the week's vacation. She is totally depressed. And then she goes to work for the magazines in one of their letters departments. I mean, it's just nothing is working for her. She's the same age as Martha Gellhorn, who's having this fantastic career. So the difference, and she's as talented. So, that just sort of happens. Then she marries Herbert Asbury, who wrote Gangs of New York and, was quite famous for that. And he's a writer at Collier's. And he falls on hard times. He can't write anymore. So she's been working on a PhD. She has to give that up and go back to work. And where does she find work? At the World Sun Telegram as the assistant to the women's editor. She manages 3 years of that, just miserable, and finally picks up the phone and calls a friend who knew her work, a reporter at the Times, not knowing that he was about to become city editor, and not knowing that the one woman on the staff was going to take maternity leave and go. And usually maternity leave did not mean returning in those days. So even though she is now 40, she gets the job at the Times. And I won't tell you the rest of her story, but I got interested in her because the Times ran a full-page picture of her with a wonderful ad in the New Yorker, just touting this terrific reporter in 1958. So anyway, maybe we'll open it up to questions, if there are any. No? Okay. Yes, Tony. Oh, my parents would have let me do anything. They would have let me do anything. I think they didn't realize that meant I was never coming home again. And that was a shock, sort of like, I think she thought, oh, you'd work till you could make a down payment on a house. I mean, I think that was sort of the attitude, not really understanding what the world had been opened to. I don't know about you, Lynn.
Oh yeah, same thing. I could have done anything, but I will say when I left Channel 2 and when I left the AP and went to television, they didn't quite get it because when I wrote for the AP, they saw my stories all the time. And now I was at local television news in New York and they lived in Philadelphia and they couldn't see me.
Yeah, what
So,
happened?
They weren't sure it was a step up.
How about you, Jim? What did your parents think?
Oh, I was basically an orphan, so it was fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would, on that same line though, you're asking what her parents thought. When I graduated from college, there were no, how do I put it, programs. There was no assistant at my college to get any career, but
Career
certainly,
counseling.
thank you, career counseling. There was no assistance to get into journalism. It was not considered what you were meant to do from certain places. I'm sure there were some schools, or perhaps there were some schools.
Well, certainly the
Not
journalism
mine.
schools. Yeah.
Yeah,
for
well,
sure.
the J schools, but and so it was a different period. And those of us who did it all, I believe, because we're driven. You don't go into this career unless you're driven.
Certainly not to make money.
Yeah.
Okay. Any others? About Nellie Bly? Oh, well, just a little bit, because, you know, that's an old subject for me, but she was a sensation in the late 1880s. She started in Pittsburgh. She worked there for 2 years, not getting to do anything that made her happy. She goes to Mexico for 6 months. Even that doesn't work. What I realize now, not knowing that when I wrote that first book, is that she's modeling herself on the women of the 1870s who were enormously successful as travel correspondents or Washington correspondents, her case travel. So she just leaves a note on the desk of her colleague and says, "Dear QO, I'm off to New York, look out for me, Bly." And off she goes. And she can't find any work on Park Row, which is where all the newspapers are. She cannot find anyone to hire her. So she is so frustrated, but someone gives her the idea to interview all the editors in town on what prospects are like for women in journalism, which is such a smart thing to do. So she interviews them all. The story goes everywhere because it's, you know, lightning. And they all say something similar. Women need chaperones. Women aren't, if a woman was really good, I suppose we would hire her, but we can never find one, and they're not versatile. They can't do enough, and they're inaccurate. Congenitally inaccurate is what they seem to think. Emotional, etc. So the story goes wild, and one of the editors in that story suggests the things you need to do to make yourself wanted, which are have great ideas, be ready to do anything, etc. So she walks into the world and she suggests that she goes steerage across the Atlantic to see what the immigrant experience is really like for someone who comes with nothing. And they thought that was too hard, too difficult. So instead they suggest she feign insanity and get herself committed to an asylum for 10 days, which she does. And I know how we could end. We could ask how she got the pen name Nellie Bly, because her name was really Elizabeth Cochran. So maybe someone knows can hum a few bars of that song. No, just a little. Someone else, I can sing it with you. Go ahead. No. Thank you.
Yeah. Wait, is that what Nellie Bly named herself after?
Yeah.
But
it was a Stephen Foster song.
wow.
We could end there, but
Still
Florence
a
has a
goodie.
question.
Still a
Florence, what
goodie.
you got? Oh, I do a little bit. So yes, I do. You know, it breaks through early, like 1880s. Yeah, women were doing this in the early 1900s and late 1800s. There's Sadie Neller Miller, who was a baseball writer for the Baltimore Telegram, go figure, in 1890, and was using her camera. There's Jessie Tarbox Beals. There are a number of women who were doing really exceptional photography early on. Yes. And then later on, we have 4 Pulitzer Prizes to a photographer. So a woman. Yes, Judith. Thank you. Okay, true. That's true. It's true. Mhm. And there definitely were other women very important, like Helen Rogers Reed, who I didn't mention, who was the editor of the Herald Tribune, who really launched the career of Dorothy Thompson. It was already launched, but who made her a household name. And Marguerite Higgins, who won the second Pulitzer Prize that went to a woman. The first one went to Anne O'Hare McCormick,
My favorite.
20 years after the prize was established. And Marguerite Higgins's comes 14 years after that. I don't think there's more to say.
Anne O'Hare, but I want to say Anne O'Hare McCormick is the one who got fascism right, because the New York Times famously kind of missed Hitler and Stalin.
She found
Mussolini.
Mussolini. She picked him out at his inaugural in the Italian parliament.
She's my favorite part of the book. She is a
I think you had
complete
one more
badass.
question.
One more. I think we're about done though. Yes. Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Heather.
Because 1840 is, you're right. 1840 is a good point to start because it's kind of considered the start of mass media. So this is an important thing, I mean, for me to say. This book is not about all women. It's not about women's page women and shows them no disrespect. But this book is about women. My editor didn't like this phrasing, but it's women who are doing men's jobs. It's women who are doing jobs men would envy. That's who I really focused on. And then, you know, with a segue to someone like Charlotte Curtis, because she figured out how to work that in a way that I don't think anyone else quite did, or at least not as sophisticatedly. People said she was someone who was against copelessness. I love that phrase. Against copelessness. I'm kind of against copelessness. I like that. Well, thank you, everybody.
Right. It's already over.